January 1943. Lake Ladoga. Minus 32 degrees Celsius. Minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit. Former Lieutenant Zubov's right eye was open. A single eye, because the other was frozen shut. His lashes fused into a solid crust of ice. This one eye, raw and inflamed from the frost, stared at a world that had itself become an eye. A vast, white, blind eye of a frozen lake, dotted with the black specks of frozen human bodies. He lay on his back, pressed into his frost-covered greatcoat, no longer feeling his legs or his left arm. The cold had ceased to be a sensation. It had become a state of matter, the state of his soul. Around him, on the cursed ice of Ladoga, lay his company, or rather, what was left of it after yesterday's attack. 200 men, thrown at German machine guns like a handful of dry peas onto a searing skillet. Now, they were part of this frozen landscape. Figures frozen into the ice, locked in their last desperate poses. Some remained face down in the snow. Others were frozen, reaching a hand toward the distant, unattainable shore. Zubov knew he wasn't alone. Not among the living. 10 meters, about 33 feet away from him, pretending to be another corpse, lay Ugol, a seasoned criminal whose eyes, even in this frost, retained a predatory, animalistic glint. A little farther behind a ridge of ice, the silhouette of Sterik was discernible, a Siberian whom even the Penal battalion couldn't break. And somewhere very close behind his back, a quiet, barely audible moan could be heard. It was Malloy, a 19-year-old kid who'd landed in the Penal Company straight from training for losing his rifle. His moan was like the creak of a frozen tree. It was faint, weak, and deadly dangerous, because 1.5 kilometers, nearly a mile away, on the high, fortified shore, sat a German. Not just a German, a sniper. He wasn't shooting at them. He was waiting. He was playing a cruel game with them. Yesterday, he had methodically picked off anyone who tried to crawl away. Today, he was targeting anyone who still showed signs of life. An hour ago, he had killed a medic who had stirred next to a wounded man. The bullet struck him squarely in the back of the head, and the red stain on the snow turned almost instantly black as it froze. Zubov understood the rules of this game. Movement was death. Sound was death. Any sign of life was death. There were no more than a dozen of them left, the living among the dead, trapped on a gigantic ice arena where a single spectator with a telescopic sight decided who would live for a few more hours and who would die right now. Hunger was no longer a sensation, but a dull, constant roar inside him. Thirst burned his throat, but eating the ice was forbidden. It meant a quick death from hypothermia. They had been abandoned by everyone. By the command that had written them off before the attack even began. By the artillery that had failed to suppress the enemy's firing positions. By fate itself. All they had left was this endless white hell and Malloy's quiet moan, which grew louder and more unbearable with every passing minute. And Zubov, the former lieutenant, demoted for leading his men out of an encirclement without orders, looked up at the gray, indifferent sky and understood that their most terrible ordeal hadn't even begun. At that moment, he didn't yet know that they would have to create their own system of survival from the bodies of their fallen comrades, that he would have to make a decision more terrifying than any military tribunal, and that their return from hell would be met not with embraces, but with the cold stare of an NKVD officer. But to understand how a handful of condemned men turned into ice phantoms, how they managed to outwit death itself on its own territory, we must go back 24 hours, to the damp twilight of a dugout where they were given their final order. To understand how they had come to this, one only needs to go back a single day. To that damp gray dawn, when their world had not yet shrunk to the size of a frozen wasteland, but consisted of frozen earth, the acrid smoke of makeshift stoves, and the heavy smell of unwashed bodies in an overcrowded dugout. This was the world of the separate Penal Company, a place where all past ranks, merits, and even names were washed away. Here were former officers like Zubov, political prisoners convicted under Article 58, and hardened criminals like Ugol, who had chosen the front over the gulag. They were all united by one thing: the right to live had to be earned anew, atoned for with blood. Preferably someone else's, but as a rule, their own. That morning, the air in the dugout was especially heavy. No one slept. The men sat on their bunks, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes from the last of their coarse tobacco, silently cleaning weapons that were more symbolic than effective. 1 rifle for every 3 men, a dozen rounds apiece, a few grenades. That was the extent of their armament for assaulting one of the most heavily fortified sectors of the German defense. Zubov sat in a corner, apart from everyone. He wasn't smoking. He was sharpening his finish knife on a whetstone. It was a mechanical, almost meditative action. Scrape, 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 scrape. The sound was calming, helping him organize his thoughts. He wasn't thinking of his wife or son. He was remembering a map. The same map he had glimpsed at headquarters when, as a former commander, he was summoned to be briefed on the objective. They didn't let him hold it, just jabbed a finger at it. Right here, Zubov. You will advance, straight across the ice. Your objective is to gain a foothold on the shore, draw fire upon yourselves, and divert enemy reserves. Understood? He understood everything. They were being sent to the slaughter. This wasn't a tactical maneuver. This was disposal. The disposal of unreliable elements. Next to him on the bunk sat Malloy, the same young kid trying to wrap fresh footcloths with fingers trembling from cold and fear. His boots were the wrong size, and he was terrified of rubbing his feet raw before the attack even started. He looked at Zubov with puppy-like adoration, as if he were the only one who retained a human form in this hell. Comrade, former lieutenant, is it true the Germans don't fight at night? He whispered. Without looking up from his knife, Zubov answered gruffly, They lie, Malloy. The Germans always fight, especially at night. On the opposite side of the dugout, in his own corner, Ugol had settled in with his small retinue of similar former criminals. They weren't cleaning their weapons. They were playing cards, for flicks on the forehead. Ugol, wiry but tough, with a face that looked as if it were carved from old wood, held a worn deck. His eyes followed not the cards, but Zubov. He despised him. Despised his posture, his clean-shaven chin, the fact that even in a penal company, he tried to remain an officer. Hey, Commander, he drawled, not addressing anyone in particular, but everyone knew who the question was for. Did you say your prayers to your Stalin? They say he forgives the sins of penal soldiers. A straight ticket to paradise. Zubov didn't answer. He finished sharpening the knife, ran his thumb pad over the blade, testing its sharpness. The steel glinted dangerously in the dim light of the oil lamp. At that moment, the company commander walked in, a captain whose face bore all the weariness and hopelessness of this war. He didn't offer any grand speeches. He just said, 15 minutes. Form up. And that was it. 15 minutes until the end. 15 minutes to finish a last cigarette, write a letter that would never be sent, or just sit in silence. Starek, an elderly Siberian with a weathered face and eyes as calm as a Buddhist monk's, took a small piece of sugar wrapped in a rag from his kit bag. He split it with his knife into several tiny pieces and offered them to his neighbors. For the road. It was a ritual. The taste of sugar on the tongue. A final memory of another peaceful life. Zubov refused the sugar. He was putting on his greatcoat, carefully adjusting the collar. He didn't know yet that this coat would become his icy shroud and simultaneously his salvation. He didn't know that his finished knife, sharpened for hand-to-hand combat, would serve an entirely different purpose: to cut frozen clothing off the dead. At that moment he was just former Lieutenant Zubov, going to carry out his last order, unaware that his most terrible battle awaited him not on the enemy shore, but on the flat, table-like surface of a frozen lake, where the enemy would not be a German machine gunner, but the cold itself, time itself, and despair itself. The signal for the attack wasn't a flare, a whistle, or a cry of, "For the Motherland." The signal was silence. the deafening, ringing silence that follows an artillery preparation. For a few minutes our batteries had shelled the German shore, but their fire was clearly insufficient. It was more of a formality, a ritualistic dance of death before the main performance. And then, when the last shell had exploded somewhere far away, that viscous, heavy silence fell. And in that silence, the hoarse, strained voice of the company commander croaked, "Let's go. Penal troops." And they went. Not running, but walking. They poured out of their shelters onto the ice, spreading into a thin, ragged chain. 200 shadows on a white canvas. Running in the deep, loose snow that covered the ice was impossible. Their legs sank, their breath catching after the first few steps. This wasn't a swift charge, but a slow, grueling march toward the horizon. Zubov walked in the front ranks. He felt the ice with his gut. He could hear it cracking under hundreds of boots, groaning in response to their steps. The sky was low and gray, indistinguishable from the equally gray, snow-covered ice on the horizon. The world had lost its color, turning into a black and white photograph. They covered the first few hundred meters in that eerie silence. The Germans were quiet. That was the most terrifying part. The silence was crushing, twisting their insides worse than any scream. It was as if the other shore was dead, uninhabited. But Zubov knew. They were watching. They were sitting in their pillboxes, their bunkers, looking through the sights of their machine guns and just waiting. Waiting for the company to enter the open, clear killing zone. When they were about a kilometer, just over half a mile from the German shore, the sky above them suddenly blossomed. One after another, signal flares hung in the gray sky. They burned with a bright, deathly white light, casting long, jerky shadows on the snow. The entire company was exposed as if on the palm of a hand. And in that same second, the silence exploded. Several machine guns opened up from the other shore at once. It wasn't just fire. It was a squall. A dense, continuous stream of lead that literally mowed people down. The sound of the German MG-42, which the soldiers had nicknamed Hitler's saw, was unlike anything else. It was a dry, furious, ripping sound that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Men fell. They fell silently, without screams. They just stumbled and buried their faces in the snow. Some tried to run only to be cut down by another burst. Some tried to hit the deck, but the bullets found them on the ice, kicking up fountains of ice chips. Zubov fell with everyone else. He wasn't hit. He just fell, obeying instinct. He lay pressed into the snow, hearing the bullets whine sickeningly right over his head. A few meters away, Malloy fell. He was on his side, looking at Zubov with wide, uncomprehending eyes. From his stomach, dark, steaming entrails were slowly spilling onto the white snow in the freezing air. He wasn't screaming, just soundlessly opening and closing his mouth like a fish thrown ashore. The attack had choked and died before it even began. Those still alive lay on the ice, not daring to lift their heads. The machine guns didn't stop for a second. They methodically raked the ice, finishing off the wounded, letting no one escape. Then, mortars joined the machine guns. The shells landed with a dull, guttural thud. A black plume of ice, snow, and water erupted around each impact. One of the shells exploded very close to Zubov. He was deafened, showered with ice fragments. When the ringing in his ears subsided a little, he realized it was over. The cries of "Ura" were never shouted. The company had been annihilated. After a few minutes, the machine guns fell silent. Then the mortars stopped. Silence returned, even more terrifying than before. It was filled with the groans of the wounded. Dozens of voices begged for help, called for their mothers, cursed everything. Zubov lay motionless. He understood. Anyone who raised their head now would be killed instantly. The Germans were just waiting. And then, in that silence, a single, dry crack of a rifle shot came from the other shore. One of the groaning wounded fell abruptly silent, then another crack, and another. Zubov understood. A sniper had started his work. He wasn't just finishing them off. He was hunting. He was picking off those who were still breathing. And at that moment, lying among the cooling bodies of his comrades in the sights of an unseen enemy, the former lieutenant realized they had fallen into a trap. A gigantic mousetrap with no way out. Their world had finally collapsed. It had shrunk to this patch of ice, to the smell of blood and gunpowder, to the quiet whistle of a bullet searching for you. This was the point of no return. The first few hours after the slaughter were the most terrible, not because of the fear of a sniper's bullet, but because of the sounds. The groans of the wounded merged into a single, prolonged, multi-voiced howl that seemed to penetrate his greatcoat, seep into his very bones, and freeze his blood more effectively than any frost. Every moan was a reminder of his own powerlessness. Zubov lay without moving, listening to this symphony of agony. He tried to count the sniper's shots. A crack, and one voice would fall silent. A pause, another crack, and another would go quiet. The sniper worked methodically, unhurriedly, like a surgeon extracting bad teeth. He didn't shoot at those who lay still. He targeted those who moved or cried out. This was the first rule of survival that Zubov learned in this icy hell. Play dead. Become a part of this landscape. Blend in with the bodies of those who no longer feel pain. But the cold was a far more terrible enemy than the sniper. It seeped in slowly, relentlessly. First, his toes went numb, then his fingers. Then it began to creep higher, towards his knees, his elbows. Zubov tried to mentally wiggle his fingers to get his blood flowing, but his body barely obeyed him. He was lying on his back, and the snow beneath him began to slowly melt from his body heat, turning into an icy crust that was freezing his greatcoat solid to the ice. Someone stirred nearby. It was Ugol. He was lying on his stomach, his eyes like two hot coals burning in the encroaching twilight. He wasn't groaning. He was cursing, quietly, venomously, under his breath, listing everyone from the company commander to the very top who had sent them here. His anger seemed to warm him from within. "Commander," he hissed so quietly that Zubov could barely hear him. "We have to move. Tonight. As soon as it's dark." Zubov didn't answer. He stared at the darkening sky. Move. Where? Back to their own lines? That was almost 2 kilometers, over a mile, across open ice. They might not be seen in the dark. But how could they go? Many were wounded. Malloy, lying nearby, was no longer groaning but quietly rattling in his chest. He had no chance of making it. Leave him, and the other wounded. When darkness finally fell, the groans became quieter. The frost was doing its work. Men were freezing to death. The sniper had also stopped shooting. A fragile, tense silence descended, broken only by the howl of the wind. And in that silence, Zubov made a decision. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, he turned his head. He surveyed the battlefield. Dozens of bodies. Some lay very close. And then his gaze fell on Starik. The old man was on his side, his back to the German shore, seemingly asleep. But Zubov knew he wasn't sleeping. He was waiting too. Zubov began to crawl. Not crawl, really, but roll, like a wounded animal. Every movement sent a jolt of pain through his entire body. He crawled to the nearest dead man, looked into his face. It was a young kid whose name he didn't even know. The boy's eyes were open, staring in surprise at the black sky. His greatcoat was almost new. Zubov took out his finish knife. His hands wouldn't obey him. His fingers had turned into wooden sticks. But with great effort, gritting his teeth, he began to cut the dead man's belts and ammo pouch to pull off his felt boots. It was monstrous, but it was the only chance. He crawled to the next one, then the next. He gathered everything that could be useful. Ammunition, grenades, pieces of greatcoats, canteens with frozen water. Ugol watched his actions with an astonishment that turned to understanding. He too began to crawl, collecting his own grim trophies. By morning they had a small cache, a few rifles, a dozen grenades, several canteens, and most importantly, several intact greatcoats. Zubov crawled over to Malloy. He was still alive, but unconscious. His breathing was shallow and intermittent. The wound in his stomach had frozen, turning into a dark, icy patch. He was dying. And then Zubov realized they couldn't carry him. He was too heavy. To leave him here was to condemn him to an agonizing death from the cold. And then, in this kingdom of death, the first, most terrible and most brilliant idea of their survival was born. He looked at the bodies of the dead, already stiff, hard as wood. And in his fevered mind, a system began to form. A system built on death. A system that could give them a chance at life. He didn't know all the details yet, but the basic principle was clear. The dead would have to help the living. Desperation is a powerful catalyst. It can either break a man, reducing him to a trembling, whimpering animal, or it can force his brain to operate with a supreme clarity and efficiency he was never capable of in ordinary life. For Zubov and the few others still alive on that field of ice, such a moment had arrived. The idea born in his freezing consciousness was both monstrous and brilliantly simple. If they couldn't walk, they must crawl. If they couldn't carry the wounded, they must drag them. But on what? The answer was all around them. Dozens of stiffened corpses turned into statues of ice. That night, under the cover of darkness and a howling blizzard that had, fortunately, started toward evening, Zubov, Ugol, and Starik, who had finally shown signs of life and crawled over to them, began their gruesome work. Their first weapon, their first invention, was the living sled. They chose two bodies lying side by side. With their knives and incredible effort, they turned them onto their backs. Then, using cut belts, they tied them together. Onto this makeshift sled, with immense difficulty, they laid the two most seriously wounded men, including the still-breathing Malloy. This was only the beginning. Their second invention was even more ghastly. They knew that even at night a sniper or sentries might spot them. They needed cover, and again the answer was right there. They began to drag the bodies of the dead and arrange them into a parapet, a low wall that would shield them from the German side. They worked in silence, in complete darkness, by feel. Their hands no longer felt the cold or the revulsion. This was just a job. Hard physical labor that strangely kept them warm. They weren't moving people. They were moving frozen logs, building material for their own salvation. By morning, they had something resembling a trench of ice, walled with the bodies of their comrades. They took shelter behind this parapet. During the day they lay motionless, blending in with the surrounding chaos. At night, when the blizzard intensified, they began to move. It was excruciatingly slow. Zubov crawled ahead, scouting the route. Behind him, Ugol and Starik dragged their terrible sled. They would advance a few dozen meters each night. Then they would freeze again until the next darkness. Hunger became their constant companion. They had no food. None at all. They tried chewing on leather belts, on pieces of their greatcoats. On the second day, Starik, who, it turned out, had been a hunter and trapper somewhere in Siberia in his civilian life, made another discovery. He used his knife to pry open a dead man's bag and found a small pouch of salt. It was a lifesaver. They began to eat snow mixed with salt. It didn't satisfy their hunger, but it gave their bodies some minerals and helped fight dehydration. They had defeated the cold by using the dead as shelter. They had solved the problem of transporting the wounded by turning corpses into sleds. They had even found a way to combat thirst. This was their first small victory. A victory over their circumstances. They had created a system. They had a rhythm. Day, stillness and sleep. Night, work and movement. Zubov had become a commander again. He assigned duties. He enforced discipline. Even Ugol, who at first had regarded all this with contempt, submitted. He saw in Zubov's actions a cold, feral logic of survival that he, as a criminal, could not help but respect. Hope, fragile as thin ice, began to flicker in their souls. They were moving. Slowly, but they were moving toward their own shore. They believed that if they followed the rules, if they were careful, they could make it out. They didn't yet know that their hostile environment, this world of ice, was preparing a new trial for them. That their first victory had not gone unnoticed. The German sniper on the other shore was not just a soldier. He was a hunter. And he had noticed that the landscape of the battlefield was beginning to change. Some of the bodies lay a little too neatly. That strange snowdrift had a shape that was a little too regular. And he decided to start his game anew. The first victory, no matter how small, is intoxicating. It provides the illusion of control. The handful of surviving penal soldiers, having created their system, felt this illusion. They were no longer helpless victims lying on the ice awaiting death. They had become an organized group, slowly but surely clawing its way back to life. Their shelter, built from bodies, had become their fortress. Their sled, made from comrades, had become their transport. Their routine, day of stillness, night of movement, had become their law. Zubov was the brain of this operation. He planned every nightly move, every stop. Starek was their hands and eyes. His hunting skills proved invaluable. He could predict the start of a blizzard from the slightest change in the wind. He taught them how to lie down to minimize heat loss. Ugol became their muscle. His animalistic endurance and rage allowed him to drag the heavy sled for hours without complaint. The other survivors, about 5 or 6 of them, mostly wounded, obeyed without question. They saw this system as their only chance. Nearly a week passed like this. 7 days and 7 nights in an icy hell. In that time, they managed to cover almost half the distance. By day, they slept, huddled together for warmth behind their ghastly parapet. By night, they crawled, leaving a barely visible trail in the snow. They learned to understand each other without words, by the slightest gesture, by a glance. They had become a single organism, a small primitive tribe living by its own laws on its tiny frozen planet. The leader, Zubov, was firmly established in his role. His word was law. He imposed the strictest discipline. For any extra noise, any careless movement during the day, he promised immediate retribution. Not because he was cruel, but because he understood that one mistake would cost all of them their lives. This harsh but predictable life gave them more than just a chance at physical survival. It gave them something more, psychological stability. They had a purpose again, a meaning. They weren't just surviving. They were fighting. Their little empire, built from the ashes of their disaster, was working. But any stability, especially in war, is fragile. Their growing organization, their slow but methodical progress, could not go unnoticed. The German sniper, who had been silent for several days, realized he was being deceived, that among these dozens of corpses, there were living men. And he decided to destroy their system. On one of the clear, frosty days when the sun was blinding as it reflected off the snow, he began his hunt. He didn't shoot to kill. His first shot was aimed at the ice parapet. The bullet struck the frozen greatcoat of one of the dead defenders with a sickening thud, kicking up a spray of stuffing and ice. Everyone behind the parapet froze. They knew. They had been discovered. The second shot hit the sled. It pierced the body serving as a runner and wounded one of the penal soldiers lying on it in the leg. The wounded man cried out. It was a short, sharp cry of pain and terror. He fell silent immediately, realizing his mistake. But it was too late. The sniper had what he wanted. Confirmation. He knew they were alive. And he knew they had wounded. Their fragile world, their empire, began to crumble. The predictable rhythm of their lives was broken. Now, every day became a torment of anticipation. They didn't know when or where he would shoot next. Their fortress had become their prison. And in this prison, under the sights of an unseen enemy, a rebellion began to brew. The voice of despair, which had been silent until now, was ready to speak at full volume. When the external enemy lies in wait, the internal enemy always comes to the forefront. Fear, which had been held in check by discipline and hope, began to seep through the cracks in their defense. And this fear was given a name: Ugol. He had never fully trusted Zubov. He had obeyed because he saw cold calculation in his plan. But now that this calculation seemed to have failed, now that the sniper had resumed his game, Ugol's feral nature took over. He no longer wanted to lie and wait. He wanted to act. "We're going to die here, Commander," he hissed one night as they lay frozen, waiting out a particularly clear, moonlit sky. "He'll pick us off one by one, like we're in a shooting gallery. We have to make a break for it. Right now. Get up and run. Someone might just make it." His words were poison. They fell on fertile ground. The other survivors, exhausted by hunger, cold, and constant tension, began to listen. Ugol's idea was simple and understandable. It was insane, suicidal, but it offered action. And any action seemed better than this endless, paralyzing wait. Zubov understood that the most dangerous moment was upon them. If he lost control now, it would all be over. The group would break apart. They would run and be shot down in minutes. He crawled over to Ugol. Their faces were inches apart. In the dim light, he could see the criminal's eyes burning. This wasn't just an argument. It was a struggle for power, a fight between two alpha males in a primitive pack. "Will you run first, Ugol?" Zubov asked quietly. There was no threat in his voice, only icy calm. "You think you're the fastest? You'll run 10 meters, maybe 20. And then the sniper's bullet will blow your head apart, and you'll die for nothing. And your death will just show him where the rest of us are hiding." "Is your plan any better?" Ugol snarled. "Lying here and waiting for him to finish us all off one by one? I don't play that game. I'd rather die running than freeze to death here like a dog." The conflict had reached its boiling point. A moment more, and they would have been at each other's throats. And then Zubov employed his surgical cruelty. But it wasn't physical cruelty. It was the cruelty of logic. "You're right," he agreed unexpectedly. "My plan could also fail, but it gives us a chance. Your plan gives us nothing but a quick death. You want to run? Run. I'm not stopping you, but the rest will stay with me, and we will watch you die, and then we will crawl on." It was a brilliant move. He didn't threaten him. He gave him a choice. And this choice put Ugol in a corner. It was one thing to incite a rebellion and lead desperate men. It was quite another to run alone to certain death in front of everyone. His authority, built on strength and audacity, would have crumbled to dust. Ugol fell silent. He looked at Zubov with hatred, but there was something else in his eyes now. Respect. He had lost this battle. Zubov had defended his law. The rebellion was quashed before it began. The group rallied around its leader once more. They had survived an internal crisis. They were whole again. But while they were sorting things out among themselves, they failed to notice that their real enemy, the cold-blooded hunter on the other shore, was preparing his final, most devastating blow. He understood that he couldn't lure them out with just random shots. So he decided to change his tactics. He decided to make them suffer so much that they would wish for death themselves. The internal enemy was defeated. Discipline, founded on Zubov's cold logic of survival, had triumphed over panic and despair. The group was once again a monolith, fused by a common purpose. But fate, or the faceless German sniper on the far shore whom they had begun to perceive as an evil destiny, decided that their trials were not yet over. The emotional peak of their tragedy had arrived, a moment that would either destroy them completely or elevate them to the level of ancient heroes performing an unimaginable feat. The sniper changed tactics. He realized that killing them one by one was slow and inefficient. He decided to break their will. The next morning, in the rays of the rising sun, He did not shoot at their shelter. He shot Malloy, the boy who had been lying unconscious on the sled for days, hovering between life and death. The bullet hit him in the thigh. It wasn't a fatal wound, but it was a wound that caused hellish pain. Malloy woke up, and he screamed. It wasn't the scream of a grown man. It was a piercing, high-pitched, childish shriek, full of pain and terror. He screamed and called for his mother. The cry tore through the silence of the frozen wasteland. It cut at their ears, their nerves, their souls. Everyone hiding behind the parapet of bodies flinched. They knew it was a trap. The sniper wasn't finishing Malloy off. He was deliberately keeping him alive. He was waiting for someone to break, to try to help the boy, to crawl to him, to silence his mouth. And then he would kill two of them. The screaming didn't stop. It went on for an hour. 2, 3. It was unbearable. The men were going mad from the sound and from their own helplessness. Ugol, who just yesterday had been calling for rebellion, now lay with his hands over his ears, howling quietly like a wounded wolf. Starek prayed, whispering something with his toothless mouth. Zubov lay with his eyes open, staring at the sky. His brain was working at a feverish pace. He analyzed the situation. Malloy's scream was bait. If anyone moved, death. If no one moved, they would all go insane, and sooner or later, someone would break. There was no way out. And then he made the most terrible decision of his life. A decision that would forever separate him from the world of ordinary men, from their morality and their laws. He crawled to Starek. "Give me your knife," he whispered. Starek looked at him in horror, but obeyed. Then Zubov crawled to the others. He spoke with each of them, quietly, harshly explaining his plan. A plan that made the blood run cold in their veins. They had to sacrifice Malloy, but not just let him die. They had to use his death to save themselves. The plan was diabolically simple. One of them, the lightest and most inconspicuous, would have to crawl to Malloy under the cover of the approaching dusk. Not to help him, but to make him scream even louder, to draw all the snipers' attention to that one point. And while that was happening, two others, including Zubov himself, would use the diversion to flank their camp and try to pinpoint the sniper's nest from the muzzle flash. It was an act of monstrous, inhuman cruelty. They were sacrificing their comrade, but it was their only chance. Starek volunteered. He said he was the oldest, that he had lived his life. In the evening, as the first shadows fell upon the ice, he began to crawl. Malloy's screams after being roused by the old man grew even louder, even more desperate. The sniper took the bait. He fired several shots toward the sled. And at that moment, Zubov and Ugol, who were already in position, saw it. They saw a brief, barely noticeable flash against the dark backdrop of the German shore. Now they knew where he was. The battle with the abyss was over. They had won. But the price of this victory was terrible. It was equal to the life of one boy and a piece of each of their souls. They were on the verge of complete exhaustion, but now they had something they didn't have before. They had a target, not just to survive, to get revenge. The price paid for knowing the sniper's location was immeasurable. Malloy's scream, cut short by another bullet, echoed in the survivors' ears for a long time. They had won this tactical duel, but they had lost something vital within themselves. Their humanity. Now they weren't just soldiers, not just penal troops. They were a pack. A pack that had lost its young and now thirsted for blood. They didn't move that night. Zubov knew that after what had happened, the German sniper would be especially vigilant. They had to let him calm down, let him believe his game was over, that any survivors were either dead or broken. They lay in their ice trench, and the silence pressed down on them with its weight. Each was lost in his own thoughts. Zubov replayed the upcoming operation in his mind. Ugol, to everyone's surprise, wasn't gloating. He lay in silence, and for the first time his eyes held no hatred, only a heavy, dull sorrow. The boy's death seemed to have touched even his criminal soul. They dedicated the next night to preparations. Under Zubov's direction, they created their final and most perfect weapon from the ashes. They took 2 Mosin Nagant rifles from the bodies of the dead. Starek, using his hunting experience, tinkered with them for a long time, checking the firing pins, fashioning makeshift slings from strips of greatcoats. Then they prepared the dummy. They took the body of one of the dead, sat it up against the parapet, put a helmet on its head, and placed a stick in its hands to simulate a rifle. This was their bait. The plan was risky, but it was the only one possible. At the first light of dawn, when visibility was still poor, Ugol, being the quickest among them, was to jerk a rope tied to the dummy, making it sway. This was meant to attract the sniper's attention and make him fire, and Zubov and Starek, who had already taken up firing positions several dozen meters from the camp, would fire 2 simultaneous shots at the enemy's nest, guided by the muzzle flash. Everything went like clockwork. The dawn mist, dead silence, a sharp tug from Ugol, the swaying figure of the sentry, and almost instantly, the dry crack of a shot from the German shore. The bullet hit the dummy's helmet dead on, and in that same second, merging into a single sound, 2 shots roared from their side. Zubov and Starek fired without aiming, just at the spot where they had seen the flash. They fired and immediately pressed themselves into the ice, waiting for return fire. But none came. A minute passed. 5. 10. The German shore remained silent. They didn't know for sure if they had hit him, but their instincts told them the hunt was over. The enemy who had terrorized them for over a week was either dead or seriously wounded. The path was clear. That night they made their last, most desperate push. They abandoned everything they had. They left their shelter, their weapons. They took only one, the lightest wounded man, and they crawled. They crawled all night without stopping, fueled by adrenaline and a final sliver of hope. They no longer felt the cold, the hunger, or the pain. They were driven by instinct alone. Towards morning, when they were on the verge of losing consciousness, they saw it, their shore. It was still far, but it was real. A dark strip of land against a gray sky. It was like a mirage. They crawled and tears froze on their cheeks. They had done it. They had survived. They were returning from hell. Collapsing on the frozen ground of their own shore, they felt no joy. Only a vast, boundless emptiness. They lay like fish cast ashore, unable to believe that the solid earth beneath them wasn't swaying, that bullets weren't whistling over their heads. The euphoria of salvation was brief. From a nearby trench, 2 soldiers were already running towards them. In their hands were submachine guns pointed at them. "Halt! Who goes there?" came a sharp, authoritative shout. Zubov tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him. He raised his head and, gathering his last strength, rasped, "Friendlies! Penal Company!" Salvation was nothing like what they had imagined in their wildest dreams. There was no hot tea, no embraces, no tears of joy from their comrades in arms. Instead, they were met with wary, distrustful stares and the barrels of submachine guns. Frostbitten, emaciated to skeletons, dressed in rags, they were mistaken for German saboteurs, or, even worse, deserters. They were half dragged into the nearest dugout. The warmth hit them, and the world swam before their eyes. Someone gave one of them a sip of spirit, another a mug of hot water. They began to shake with fever. Their bodies, having fought the cold for so long, now didn't know how to react to warmth. But the respite was short-lived. Soon, he entered the dugout. A man from another world. He wore a perfectly clean, tailored greatcoat, a new pistol holster hung from his belt, and he smelled of good tobacco and the frost. He was a captain from the special department, the kind they called an osobist behind his back. He had a tired, expressionless face and very attentive, cold eyes. He didn't introduce himself. He just sat on a stool opposite Zubov, who had by now recovered a little, and began the interrogation. "Surname, rank, unit?" Zubov answered. His voice was hoarse and alien. He told them everything. About the attack. About how the company had perished. About how they survived on the ice. He talked about the parapet of bodies, the sleds made of the dead, The duel with the sniper, the sacrifice of Malloy. He spoke, and the captain listened in silence, his expression never changing. Occasionally, he made notes in his little notebook. When Zubov finished, a heavy silence fell in the dugout. The osobist looked at him for a few seconds and then asked, with not a hint of sympathy in his voice, only dry statement of fact. "So, you claim that for over a week, you were on open, fire-swept ice, in direct view of the enemy, and you survived?" "That is correct," Zubov rasped. "And you expect me to believe that?" The captain smirked. "The enemy shore is 1.5 kilometers away. Anyone who moves on that ice is taken out within a minute. And you were out there for a whole week, building an empire, as you say?" The story of their survival, their feat, sounded like the ravings of a madman in this warm, safe bunker, like a clumsy, foolish fabrication. They were interrogated one by one. Ugol, true to his nature, tried to be defiant, but after one short punch to the gut, he deflated and began to tell the same story confusedly. Starek just nodded silently. Their accounts matched in detail, but this, paradoxically, worked against them. It was too coherent, too much like a pre-rehearsed legend. To the osobist, it was simple. The attack had failed. The company was lost. And this handful of cowards had hidden out somewhere among the ice hummocks and now showed up, spinning tall tales to avoid a tribunal for desertion. Their feat, their inhuman will to live, their terrible sacrifices, all of it was crossed out by a single stroke of a pencil in an interrogation report. Their salvation had become a new prison. They had escaped the hell of ice only to fall into a bureaucratic hell, a hell of mistrust and suspicion. A field investigation which Zubov insisted upon confirmed their words. They did indeed find their gruesome parapet on the ice, the remains of Malloy on the sled, and even the sniper they had killed on the other shore. This saved them from a firing squad, but not from the system's verdict. The order was short and clear. For cowardice displayed in battle and unauthorized abandonment of positions, resulting in the loss of the company, all survivors were to be sent back to a penal company, to atone, with blood. It was the final, most brutal blow. Their brotherhood, forged in the depths of an icy hell, was destroyed. Their feat was buried alive under a classified stamp. They received no medals, and they weren't even given the chance to tell the truth. They were simply handed a rifle again and pointed in a new direction, west. Fate, showing an unparalleled cruelty, had granted them life only to take it away a short time later, but by other hands. Their story did not end with salvation. Salvation was merely the prologue to their oblivion. For the war machine, their return was an inconvenient statistical anomaly. Their feat did not fit into the heroic dispatches. It was too terrible, too real. So it was simply erased. The survivors were scattered among different units so they could no longer communicate, so that their shared memory, their shared truth, would dissolve in time. The fate of each of them was different, but a common thread of tragedy ran through them all. Former Lieutenant Zubov, as a man with command experience, was appointed a platoon commander in another penal company. He fought as if he were seeking death. He led his men into the most hopeless attacks. He went where no one returned from. It was said he had lost his instinct for self-preservation. But in truth, he simply could no longer live with that memory, with the decision he had made on the ice. He was killed 2 months later during the assault on some nameless hill, killed by a random mortar fragment. His body was never recovered. He just vanished, dissolved into the bloody meat grinder of war like hundreds of thousands of others. Ugol, the criminal who survived the icy hell, did not survive army discipline. His feral nature could not submit to the new rules. A month later, after another conflict with an officer, he was shot by a firing squad in front of the ranks for insubordination in a combat situation. He died as he had lived, with curses on his lips, unbowed to the very end. Starek, the Siberian hunter whose wisdom had helped them survive, turned out to be the luckiest, or the unluckiest. As he was too old and infirm, he was medically discharged after a severe wound. He returned to his distant Siberian village, but he could never return to a normal life. For the rest of his days, he barely spoke. He would just sit on the bench outside his house, look at the river, and remain silent. The villagers thought he had lost his mind. No one knew what images played before his eyes, what screams he heard in the silence. He died in his bed many years after the war, but his soul remained forever there, on the ice of Lake Ladoga, next to the boy he had crawled to kill in order to save the others. The other survivors, the few men whose names history did not even preserve, perished in the meat grinder of subsequent battles. They were just numbers in the casualty reports. They had won their own small personal war against cold, hunger, and death. But they lost in their collision with the larger, indifferent world. Their experience was too horrifying to share. Their truth was too inconvenient to be heard. They remained forever what the war had made them, ghosts. Ghosts who returned from hell but could never find a place in the world of the living. They were buried alive a second time, the first time, on the ice of Ladoga. The second time, in archives under a classified stamp and in the memories of those who chose to forget. But as old frontline soldiers used to tell, a strange legend circulated in that sector of the front for a long time. A legend of a phantom company that sometimes appears during blizzards on the ice of Lake Ladoga. The official history of war is written by the victors. It consists of dates, operation names, army and division numbers. It has a place for great commanders and canonized heroes, but it has almost no place for stories like this one. The story of the penal troops who survived on the ice of Ladoga was erased from all official chronicles. In the loss reports, the 9th Separate Penal Company was marked as completely annihilated while performing a combat mission. A short, clear, convenient phrasing. It required no further questions or uncomfortable investigations. It simply closed the page. But the real story, the so-called trench truth, does not die. It lives on in rumors, in soldiers' tales, in legends passed in whispers around a campfire. The story of the ice phantoms of Ladoga became one such legend. It was said that during severe blizzards, when visibility drops to zero, you can see shadows on the lake's ice. Shadows of men crawling slowly from the German shore toward ours, dragging strange sleds behind them. It was said that these were the souls of those same penal soldiers who never found peace. Among the soldiers who fought on the Leningrad front, there was a belief that if you got lost in a blizzard on Ladoga, you shouldn't shout or call for help. You should lie down on the ice and play dead. And then maybe the phantom company would crawl past, taking you for one of their own, and not take you with them. This story turned into a myth, a grim fairy tale told to new recruits to teach them the most important law of war. Sometimes to live, you have to die. Die to the enemy, to your own side, to the whole world. Only then do you have a chance. What happened to their empire, built from bodies? The spring consumed it. When the ice on Ladoga broke up, it carried away all traces of their monstrous feat. The bodies of their comrades, which had served as their walls and sleds, found their final rest at the bottom of the lake. The water washed everything away. The blood, the fear, the despair. Only the legend remained. A legend of an unbreakable will to live and of tragic oblivion. This story is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a reminder that the most terrible battles of the Second World War were fought not on the maps of general staffs, but in the souls of ordinary people placed in inhuman conditions. It is a story about how heroism can take different forms. Sometimes, heroism is not throwing yourself on a machine gun nest with a grenade, but making a monstrous decision that will save your men, yet kill a part of you forever. This is a story that shows surviving hell is only half the battle. The much harder part is coming back from it and proving to the world that you are still human. Write in the comments what you think of this story. Was their struggle worth such sacrifices? And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history that you won't find in official textbooks.